Hello and welcome back. Today we will be continuing our video series, our tutorial series in Victoria 3, and we will be talking about unincorporated versus incorporated states. I'm going to try and divide this up into two sections. In the first section, which we're experiencing now, I'm going to be talking about what are the differences between incorporated and unincorporated states, as well as where are some, other background features where it's important to think about incorporation status. And then in the second half, I'll talk about more about what the strategy of what I think is strong, given the information on the incorporated states. So first up, we have the tooltips for the incorporated states and unincorporated states. They tell you kind of 4 of the 7 reasons, or 4 of the 7 differences between the two. And the first and most important one is mentioned in both in the incorporated state tooltip, which is that your institutions and tax system apply to incorporated states, but not to unincorporated states. This is the biggest reason to want to incorporate. When you go to incorporate, your incorporation cost is based in bureaucracy, and this is based on taxing as well as in putting in all your institutions. It is based on the cost that will be required to do that. You pay all of the bureaucracy up front, and then it takes an amount of years depending on, how close the population are to, your homeland or your native cultures. So for example, here in Namaqualand, it takes 20 years, which is the max, but if we go to Cape Colony, it would take only 5 years because we share a heritage, cultural trait, European heritage with the people who are here. Okay, so you pay the bureaucracy cost up front. It gives you access to in the institutions, all of which are important, but it's too much to go into here. And then also, it gives you access to your tax system with one special exception, which is that consumption taxes always apply to both incorporated and unincorporated states. So the biggest reason to want to incorporate states is to gain a larger tax base. But also, another way to think of things is that, you might not necessarily want to tax pops. If you don't want to tax pops if certain jobs, you can just leave them out of incorporated states. Okay, so this is the first thing. The second one is that pops that are in incorporated states will have more political power. The tooltip for incorporated state doesn't tell you how much because, the tooltips are kind of not that great, but the tooltip in unincorporated state does tell you how much, which is minus 50% universal pop political strength. So pops will be twice as powerful in terms of political strength in incorporated states than in unincorporated states, and this is a pretty important feature. So often at the times in early runs, you will want to, or in early game, you will want to disempower the landowners as much as possible. And so if this is part of your strategy, you would rather build buildings that are owned by them in unincorporated states, i.e. buildings that are owned by the aristocrats. That way they gain half the political power they would normally per building. But you probably just want to import the goods that they would be producing, if you can. So this is the third reason, or no, that's the second reason. The third reason, or the third and fourth, are kind of minor, but they are included in here, which you suffer an infrastructure malus and minus 50% conscriptable battalions. Now, the infrastructure malus is minus 25%, but this has to be considered along with another feature of unincorporated states, which generally you'll want to go Colonial Exploitation, which gives a 10% throughput bonus on all buildings, which if you take that into account when you're thinking of infrastructure and you look at the railway is getting a 10% throughput bonus, which does apply to the infrastructure in itself. And so you think of it more as a 15% malus, but a big malus on the base in terms of, the infrastructure on the unincorporated state. And then we have the conscriptable battalions. Okay, so that's kind of the first big 4, and these are the important differences in terms of just direct differences. But there's also a few other features in the game that are dependent on incorporated status, and so let's talk through them here. The first is your normal wage, what's called the normal wage. Your government wages are based off of the average wage in all of your incorporated states, and so if you want to try and drive down government wages, you should incorporate places with low standard of living or low wages. Generally speaking, I don't think this is a very important way of going about it in terms of game mechanics, but this is something to consider. Your normal wages based on this. If you, click on some unincorporated states, you go to the population tab, you will see that, generally speaking, your unincorporated states will have lower standard of living. These are all unincorporated than your incorporated states. And so what this means is the incorporated states, if you are constantly adding unincorporated states, this might be a way to drive down government prices as a consequence of government wages. Just something to think about. The second thing is your literacy rate is based off of only incorporated pops, and the amount of research you get is 50 plus your literacy rate times 1.5. This is your research cap. You see that we are capped right now at 147, which is 1.5 times this plus 50. We have uncapped research. Now, very briefly, because this isn't a video about research, your uncapped research will apply to your tech spread of other nations, as if any other nation is ahead of you on other tech, and so it's not useless to have extra uncapped, but increasing the capped thing is pretty good deal. And so if you start incorporating a bunch of places willy-nilly, especially poor places, with lower standard of living, you will tend to decrease the literacy rate. So this is just another thing to consider when thinking about incorporation status. And the third and final thing is colonization speed. Your colonization speed is based on your population, but only the incorporated population. So for example, our population here in Great Britain with 70 million incorporated is going to be, it's based off the 70 million, not the 116 million, which is important to consider if maybe you want to try and colonize faster. In this run, we did a quick thing of grabbing Beijing early on, and we could have incorporated it, but we decided not to. It has a lot of pops. It would have made us colonize a lot faster had we incorporated it. But man, oh man, that's a lot of bureaucracy. And so the bureaucracy cost is based off of the cost of incorporating or paying for all the institutions, which in turn is based on the population. And so you might notice like some interesting tensions where you want to drive down the standard of living, perhaps, in your incorporated states so that you have a lower normal wage, except for sometimes you want to overpay government officials anyways. This is a reasonable thing, but then you might want to drive it up in order to increase education access, which would increase literacy, which increases, your ability to research stuff. Now, importantly, access to education is more based off of having a sort of flatter economic system. Like, if these are all very close to each other, that's better for literacy, which is what you see in incorporated states. They are very close. It is much more flat economically, whereas unincorporated states will tend to be a lot more stratified, which it means to say the lower rung pops will be further away from the affluent pops in terms of percentage. It's very nearly double right here, and here it's more than double, but that's a bad example, I suppose. It will tend not to be that stratified. I take it all back. We have a very stratified economy here. Part of that is actually all of our manufacturing is here, which is part of our strategy. So that's actually a secondary thing. But these are the 7 sort of features. So just very quickly, institutions and tax systems will apply in your unincorporated states. Your clout will be increased in incorporated states. You will have colonization rate is based on incorporated states. Your infrastructure will be decreased in unincorporated states, less the bonus you get from colonial exploitation. Your literacy rate is calculated based on incorporated pops, and your normal wage is calculated based on incorporated pops. These are the differences. Let's talk about one additional thing, because I think it is the most important thing in terms of thinking about sometimes you want to have unincorporated states, because getting extra tax is really good, and that is colonial exploitation law. Now, this decreases the subsistence output in unincorporated states, and it decreases the starting wages. Kind of a good way of thinking about this is it makes it easier to get pops out of, your out of subsistence farms and into whatever you have in the state, because these will pay them less money, and so they will get off the subsistence farms or migrate much easier, which makes employing a little bit easier. So that's kind of what that effect is, but the most important one here is the 10% throughput bonus in unincorporated states. This is quite large, and since I think colonial exploitation is just better, you can think of all your states as having a 10% throughput bonus when they are unincorporated. Here we are getting 3% from economies of scale, 10% from rural folk, and 10% from colonial exploitation. And so the opportunity cost of incorporating is often this 10% throughput bonus. Okay, so those are kind of the broader features. Now let's cover two more things that are kind of like incorporated versus unincorporated, but it's not quite. And that is your market capital and your capital estate. Your market capital will give 25% migration attraction and 25% infrastructure, so it is in essence very similar to a super incorporation. It will also give increased political power for your capital state, except I think this tooltip is bugged. I don't think it's supposed to give migration attraction and infrastructure. I believe it's supposed to give 25% or 50% to political strength. I'm not sure what it's supposed to give, but I just think this tooltip is bugged to be, you know, this giving the same amount as your market capital. This is my understanding, because it says it gives political strength and it doesn't say that it gives migration and infrastructure, whereas this one says it gives migration and infrastructure, and the wiki says migration and infrastructure and political strength for the capital state. So this is a kind of way to think about it. In the next section, we're going to talk about, you know, what you maybe want to do as a consequence of these differences. Okay, so what should the strategy be, given what we've discovered? I think in an ideal world, you'd do two things. You would have all of your manufacturing in incorporated states, and you would have all of your rural stuff benefiting from your colonial exploitation 10% throughput bonus. And so, just allow me to repeat this. All of your finished goods, i.e. all of your urban buildings, your manufactories, I think you want in incorporated states. The reason for this is these will pull enormous populations, and they are your more efficient buildings in terms of, you know, their PMs in terms of making money. I think all of these should be incorporated states, because if you take a look here, we have like 2/3 of our, well, not quite 2/3, but a big chunk of our economy in incorporated population just in the British Isles, and we are driving up the standard of living there, which is causing people to migrate there, and they are coming there and then they're paying taxes. So we are not bringing the taxes to them, they are coming to the taxes, because these buildings are really profitable, and also pops with higher standard of living just pay more in taxes. Generally speaking, taxing is much less efficient on poor pops. So this is why I think all the manufacturing you want in incorporated states. The reason why you want all of the rural stuff, i.e. coal mines and such, in unincorporated states is this 10% throughput bonus, because what ends up happening is hyper late game, you will run shortages of hardwood and of oil and all these things. And this is the limiting factor from expanding the economy, because you cannot expand these rural things any further. You can expand the manufacturing as much as you want, but the limiting throttle will be the rural outputs, and the way to increase these rural outputs is through colonial exploitation, and also, generally speaking, in terms of population, these will start to employ less and less as you use later and later PMs, but getting like this 10% throughput bonus on oil allows you to use much more efficient PMs elsewhere, or getting it on coal lets you use more efficient PMs elsewhere. And if you make, you know, the coal way cheaper by having this throughput output, you know, this might make the coal factory less efficient, which makes these people make less money, which makes them pay less in taxes, especially, you know, the taxes with your, dividends tax. They'll pay significantly less on dividends taxes as they're less profitable, but it makes coal cheaper in your market, which makes everything which uses coal, which is kind of everything, it makes all of these more profitable. And these can expand infinitely, so when you use a labor-saving technique, you can just build a whole bunch more furniture manufacturers, which will employ more people. And so the infinite horizon of expansion on these means that the throttle is on all the rural territory. Now, in theory, you actually, kind of early game, I think you should try and import most of this stuff if you can. Let other countries do it, and then focus on manufacturing in your place as well. A further extension of this is, if you could build everything in your capital, all your manufacturing in your capital, it would be even better to build it all in your capital, and you just slap down, you go to decrees and you slap down encourage manufacturing, you encourage manufacturing in the capital, because the capital has some special bonuses. The capital gets, it gets the market capital, assuming you have market and state capital the same, it gets migration attraction and infrastructure, plus 25% to both. And also, if you hover this tooltip, you see that this tooltip is bugged, and it says it gives even more migration attraction. But then if you move to the right, it changes the tooltip. And now it gives increased taxation capacity, which is a nice modifier, and universal pop political strength. So, it is cheaper to tax the pops in the capital, because you require fewer administrations to do it. You will also eventually get the skyscraper in the capital, which gives increased bureaucracy as well. So the overall cost of, managing in the capital is better. And you will also have, massive throughput bonus. In this case, we are encouraging manufacturing here in the capital. The more places you encourage manufacturing, the more expensive it is in terms of authority. In theory, you would want to have just one manufacturing center and just build it up infinitely tall and then encourage manufacturing there, which raises the question, why can't you just do that? The problem is a modifier. For population attraction, eventually you will start to get the overpopulated modifier, which decreases the percentage here. Here, the modifier is really mild. We're getting plus 100% from a variety of things. So we have standard of living right here, which is then standard of living right here, which is then modified by our 25% plus 25% plus 50%. So that's from the trade center, the market capital, the Intelligentsia. And a decrease from overpopulated. This overpopulated modifier is one that is based on the amount of arable land in a state. And so here we have 103 unused arable land and then 13 arable land that's used for a total of 116. The amount of population you need before you start running this malice is this malice on migration attraction. It is proportional to your total arable land, so generally speaking, places with more arable land will be harder to overpopulate. So for example, almost all these Chinese land, these states are really weird in terms of how this is how they manage the mechanic in terms of, explaining and having all the people don't migrate away from China is they give them like 1,500 arable land in some of these states. And I think this is kind of a little bit of an absurdity, but I also am not super familiar with, I'm actually somewhat familiar with China, but it gives you a ton of arable land, which means that they won't migrate away, or they won't run the malice. And so in principle, you would actually want to have your capital in a place with a ton of arable land, and then build up super tall there, encourage manufacturing there, and all this sort of thing. And then eventually you run the malice. So, you want to have all your manufacturing in incorporated states, and all of your rural stuff in unincorporated states. And so here's what you do. You can't do it all in the capital because eventually you'll just start running this overpopulated thing too big. But what you do is you just keep expanding in incorporated states that you start with until you start running this malice in a few places. And then you just start incorporating more states. I think this is the strategy. A secondary addendum or addition to that is from a practical perspective, you kind of want to have a decent auto queue, you want to have a decent amount of places auto expanding. You notice all the places here that are auto expanding are over 50, but that's because, or over 51, you get the maximum throughput bonus at 51, where you are getting plus 50% output from economies of scale, so you want to have this on all your manufacturing. And in theory, as you add more and more incorporated states, you can have more and more places auto expanding, because we can't. If we could in the capital, we would want to, we'd love to set it to auto-expand +5 tooling workshops instead of +1, but it just does +1. So from a practical perspective, having more incorporated states would be nice because it allows you to have more places auto-expanding. But in terms of just the theory, I think that you want all your manufacturing in incorporated states. You want all of your rural stuff in unincorporated states. Unfortunately, that's not possible. You do have, for example, we have these all the way expanded in incorporated states, and it's really not too bad because these people pay taxes. The average wage here is 21. Let's see the average wage over here, although there's a variety of factors affecting that. It's a little bit less. But okay. Now, there's a few other things that are maybe worth considering. The first is that you might want to, this is something I did early on, where I would use different PMs for incorporated states versus unincorporated states in regards to the ownership, or also, in regards to, labor-saving techniques. This is something you can do. I don't think it's too worth reading into. I lost my cheat sheet. Oh, there it is. But you could be more aggressive about using labor-saving PMs in unincorporated territories because you're not taxing those pops, and so driving it so that there are fewer jobs available there, so they have to migrate, might be something worth doing. Also, the ownership PMs privately owned. So I used to think privately owned was a little bit better than what it was relative to publicly traded. And so what I did for a little while is I would run privately owned in all of my incorporated states to make them more competitive, and publicly traded in unincorporated states. Another thing you can do is often electricity is not profitable even if you're running a shortage. Often producing electricity is not profitable even if you're running a shortage. In theory, what you could do is you could run this electricity in an unincorporated state, just all of your electrical industries in an unincorporated state, in order to get the plus 10% throughput bonus. And you could even do this in an unincorporated state like, let's say, Ontario, which has the Niagara Falls modifier, which gives plus 20% building electricity throughput. So if you were running that, if you were running that plus encourage manufacturing, and then you had trade unions, industrial modifiers, and then 50% economies of scale bonus, what is that? That's 60, 110% bonus, throughput bonus. Very, very nice. And so this might be a strategy. I think what you do want to avoid, though, is you want to avoid having buildings. So, for example, we have tailors here, or textile mills. I think if you have textile mills in incorporated territories, you really don't want to have a whole bunch of textile mills in unincorporated territories. And the reason why is you do not want your incorporated buildings to compete with your unincorporated buildings. Your incorporated buildings are paying taxes. They are paying taxes in part, depending on your tax system, based on dividends tax rate, which is related to how much money or how profitable the buildings are. If your incorporated states are competing with unincorporated states in terms of the manufacturing, they will get throttled. And they will get throttled because of this 10% throughput bonus, for starters, as well as, generally speaking, the lower rung population is generally willing to work for less in unincorporated territories. Which means the buildings that are paying you taxes based on how much money they make will not be profitable, whereas the buildings that don't pay any taxes based on how much money they get will be extra profitable. Here these buildings were there to start with, and we're just not deleting them, is kind of what's going on, just because I don't think it's quite worth it to delete it, but they're just there. So, that's another thing, is in theory, with specifically motors, notably, you could, so for example, one that's really inefficient is automobile production. You could have automobile production, specifically in an unincorporated state, just to get the 10% economies, or the 10% throughput bonus from Colonial Exploitation. You could also do it with electricity before you get coal mining, and you could specifically target, I don't know all the states that give this bonus, the 20% electricity bonus. I know Ontario and New York does. These ones give the Niagara Falls specific one. I think there's another one like in Austria that also gives it, or something like this. There are more in other areas of the world. I guess I just don't know where they are. And I'm not going to hunt them down, but this is something to consider. Just don't have them competing with each other. And just know you will be hemorrhaging value to the taxation, because you're not going to be taxing them, which also makes the businesses more profitable. If they're not getting taxed, yeah, they'll just... I don't know if I've mentioned this already, because I've done so many takes of this, but generally speaking, the businesses or the economies or the population will be more stratified in unincorporated territories, all other things equal, but generally also all other things are not equal. If you notice here, it's more stratified for us here, because currently the industrialists are taking a big share of the pie because of all the manufacturing that's going on here. There's no manufacturing here. So that's kind of what's going on there. And I have a couple more notes. Investment pool contribution is another interesting one. So in general, in unincorporated states, and I don't know necessarily the best way to push this, but you are still kind of, in a sense, making income from capitalists in unincorporated states because they are still paying into the investment pool contribution based on how profitable the buildings are. And so in unincorporated states, you would prefer the capitalists make a ton of money and the non-capitalists make less money. So you want the buildings to be as profitable as possible, but this is kind of just... I don't see a specific way to capitalize on this relative to incorporated states, because you also want your incorporated states to be relatively profitable. But just know that your capitalist getting a larger share of the pie is more valuable in unincorporated states because they will still pay into the investment pool transfer even if they aren't paying taxes. Another thing I found quite interesting was colonial exploitation, the modifiers, which give, you know, the decreased starting wage. So this decreased starting wage is also better for moving people off of subsistence farms into working. But this 10% throughput modifier also applies to a wide variety of things, which I think it has no business applying to. The first of which is it applies to subsistence pastures itself. If you notice, we are getting a throughput bonus and we're getting the rural folk, and also colonial exploitation, which is like, huh? The biggest egregious, like, violator of this is the unique building, the Forbidden City, or any unique building, just any building benefits from this throughput bonus, where we are getting plus 10% from colonial exploitation. So by exploiting the Chinese here, we're making better use of the Forbidden City than they could, making our government more legitimate and giving more authority. What? So I found this pretty interesting. But yeah, the general strategy: put all your manufacturing in incorporated states. This will pull your pops to the incorporated states as the standard of living rises, because these are generally more efficient, and it leaves you more natural resources to exploit as the game gets into the late game, because you get the throughput bonus on colonial exploitation, and then expand your incorporated territories as needed to try and make sure you're ditching the malice on population attraction, except in the capital, which is probably worth just attracting to anyways. You notice we have the market capital here, and this also has a trade center. This overpopulation modifier has to be more than 25% for it to just be exceeding the market capital, for it to be like equilibrium above the market capital. So we're still pretty chilling here, and we are looking to incorporate a little bit more territory in Great Britain. I do think that in general, I play a little more RP style, and I am less aggressive with incorporating than I should be. The primary cost is the amount you pay up front, you know, with the bureaucracy. I think that if you did not pay the upfront bureaucracy cost, it's possible you would want to incorporate even more territories. If you are running, as just a general part of the strategy, if you are running a ton of extra bureaucracy, and you will be for some time, you should consider incorporating a couple more states, maybe just a little bit here and there. And if you are going to do that, I think a good way of thinking about which states you want to get and which states you want to incorporate, and this is probably the final piece of advice here, is that you want to incorporate states that don't have a lot of resources relative to their arable land. Because the amount you can build up the manufacturing and attract people to is relative to the arable land. And so having a really high arable land count and a really low resource count is what you are looking for, because this means you can bring a ton of pops there and sacrifice the minimum amount of, you know, wood, steel, iron, coal, like these types of things. States that are particularly good for this are, like, all the China states are really good for this. These are reasonable to incorporate because they don't give anywhere near as much coal as they give, you know, agriculture. And the states in India are also reasonable on this front. However, these will be really expensive to incorporate because of such high population. but also just states that have no natural resources. So I'm looking for one. Actually, I think every state has logging, but a lot of states will only have logging, and that's it. And they will be good ones to incorporate because you are not losing out on as much resources when you incorporate them. And then also having a really high arable land count means that you can expand the factories a whole bunch before you start running this attraction malice from overcrowding. And so that's kind of both what the differences are, as well as what I think you should do about it and how you should think about it. If you think I missed anything, feel free to put it in the comments. There are a lot of oblique, weird things, like the literacy thing is kind of oblique. It is based on incorporated pops, so having incorporated pops be high standard of living, like this sort of thing, and also the normal wages, what is based on that. So, what was it? Yeah, the normal wage is based on not your average wage in your entire country, but just the average wage in incorporated states. So what you pay government wages on is based on incorporated state average wage. And there was like the third kind of like oblique one. I forget what it was right now. Oh, it was your colonization speed is based on incorporated pops, not unincorporated pops. And so, in theory, if you're trying to colonize as fast as possible, you should be even more aggressive about incorporating. And so, these are kind of all the things. The general heuristic, I think, is pretty easy. If you are playing just like any colonial power in Europe, and you just don't want to think too much, I think you should just keep all your homeland incorporated, build all your manufacturing there, don't build it anywhere else, and then just like kind of think about incorporation like that. If you like this video, feel free to like, comment, subscribe, or share. If you have a suggestion for anything you want a tutorial on, feel free to put it in the comments. And then if you've been sitting a while, maybe take a walk, because, you know, in terms of walks aren't sexy, but they make you feel better. A lot of things like they don't make for a particularly good story, but they improve your lived experience a lot. One is walking, another is drinking water. Where's my water bottle? But yeah, au revoir, goodbye, good day. May the sun never set on this British Empire here.